Chapter 7 is all about service products. What we mean by service is how the services sector is both similar to and different from tangible products that we've discussed previously. So we'll talk about the nature of services, the 7 Ps, service quality, how to brand services, and service recovery. A service is an activity which benefits recipients even though they own nothing extra as a result. In other words, we can't really touch or feel true service products. A service is the production of an essentially intangible benefit, either in its own right or as a significant element of a tangible product, which through some form of exchange satisfies a need. Some service product examples could be personal services, such as hairdressing or nail salons, could be medical, such as dentistry or surgeries. It could be a business service, such as consultancy or maintenance services that are done for your business. Could be financial, such as banking or insurance. Electronic services are things like e-commerce or shopping services, gaming, social networking. Leisure services are things like spas or sports facilities. Hospitality are things like hotels and restaurants. There's cleaning services, and finally, car servicing services. And of course, there's many others that you can imagine that fall into these categories that are primarily an intangible service. With regard to service sectors in the United States, the service sector has more employment in knowledge-based service industries. And this is probably because consumers have more leisure time, and so they demand more leisure services. We're having more of a popularity of outsourcing services. For example, outsourcing your holiday decorations or outsourcing someone to do your errands or personal assistance. And redundant workers are setting up their own small businesses, often consultancy, training, and coaching. I guess that would mean that my consulting business is considered part of the service sector growth. And then more complex modern products require support services. So for example, even things that were once 100% manufactured products, like a Hershey's chocolate bar, are now combined with services that the company might do for consumers, such as entertainment or online, or, the website, a 1-800 number, those types of intangible support services. And the service element is often a key way to differentiate between similar products. So you've all heard of after-sale service, or the service that you get at one place is better than the service that you get for the exact same need at another place. So we often emphasize the service in our promotional communications as well. Now, we've looked at this illustration before, where right at the center is the core product, or in this case, the core benefit. And then in the middle ring, we have the actual components of the service, things like the features, the branding, the people, which is very important in service delivery, the quality, the processes, and the accessibility. And finally, on the outer ring, the tangibles. So in other words, there are oftentimes tangible things that are provided with the service. And this example in your text goes through a concert example. But we could take any of these services on one of the previous slides and think about what is the core benefit of a hairdresser or a hair salon. What are the services that they provide? And then is there anything tangible we get upon leaving? Now, the reason that services has its own chapter is because services marketing has to differ from product marketing. And there's a couple of factors that differentiate services from manufactured goods. And we really call them, or I like to call them, the 4 I's: the inseparability, the inconsistency, inventory, and intangibility. So let's go over those 4. And your textbook sometimes doesn't call them exactly the same thing. It doesn't call them the 4 I's, but it's like how I like to teach it. So ultimately, the factors are the same. So let's talk about those. Let's discuss those 4 in more detail with some examples. So you might want to take notes on these explanations of those factors. The first is that services are intangible. That means that services cannot be touched, felt, or experienced prior to purchase. So while I can touch and feel a Hershey bar, while I can turn the Hershey bar over and compare its nutritional information to a Snickers bar, I cannot compare 2 potential service offerings. For example, I can't compare 2 hairstylists and know prior to engaging in a contractual exchange relationship which one of those will provide the better service. So services are intangible. That's the first I. The second I is that services are time and place dependent, meaning that they are provided at a given time and place. They cannot be stored, they cannot be transported. So therefore, they are perishable. So in other words, we would not have any warehousing costs with a service. If we don't sell every single hotel night tonight at our hotel, we cannot save those unused hotel rooms for another night. Therefore, services do not carry inventory. Now, yes, they might carry inventory, manufactured goods or supplies that help in the creation of a service. For example, a restaurant obviously carries inventory in their refrigerator or in their pantry, in their back room. A hair salon has inventory with regard to its goods in the back and the things it needs, the tangible things it needs to operate the business. But the actual purchase of the service itself, the haircut or the actual restaurant meal, does not carry over. So unsold services do not exist. We do not have inventory here. The third I is that the service provider becomes part of the service. And so in other words, the service provider is inseparable from the service itself. In fact, the consumer is also part of the service experience. And finally, the fourth I is that services are often inconsistent, especially those personal services. Because of these 4 differentiating factors, the services marketing mix is a bit broader than our traditional 4 Ps of product, promotion, place, and price. The 5th P with regard to services are people. This addresses inconsistency and inseparability. Number 6 is process. This often affects perishability or inventory issues. For example, a company assessing what we would call their idle production capacity. And number 7, the physical evidence addresses sort of the intangibility of the service. And so let's talk about these number 5, 6, and 7 in more detail. First, the people. People are the face of a service business. And a key determinant of service success is often in the hiring, training, attitude, and efficiency of those service providers. A lot of this means that service-based, quote unquote, products really need to focus on relationship marketing. And then we get into broader issues, especially in the international realm, of whether or not people should, that are the face of our service, should be expats or whether they should be locals. The sixth P of physical evidence is that, as I was mentioning before, whether it's, the concert ticket or whether it's the restaurant meal, most services have some form of tangible element, but it's usually a peripheral product. That could be the house style and livery or the clothing of your employees, the facilities, the ambiance. And many times when we are doing a service assessment, I used to teach a master's in accounting course on services marketing. And we talked a lot about, assessing the environment in which people come to an accountant's office, or how they interact with the quote unquote physical evidence of that accounting firm. And sometimes that physical evidence can actually be a website, or it could be what information they get from you that's sent to their home. It could be their interaction with the physical facilities in the way that they call your office or the way they park at your office. So a lot of physical evidence should be assessed from the perspective of the consumer. And finally, process. And that's how the service is actually provided. If we're talking about a restaurant, it would be, is it self-service? Is it table service? And then we often map the customer journey, which I think I have an illustration on the next slide, but it's mapping the customer's experience. It could be through physical facilities or even through web pages. The process is how we make reservations, or how you reserve, or how you book or process orders. It can be how you deal with customer inquiries. And some of the challenges with this P is integration of all of the elements that go into that service provision, whether it's from the delivery of the raw materials or the creation of the service itself to the follow-up afterwards, and that whole understanding of what do you do best, and maybe is it better to outsource certain parts of the service offering? And if that's the case, then how do you control all aspects of that service offering? And finally, one of the bigger issues in processes is what kinds of quality control standards the service firm has created or established. So your text talks about training. Your text talks about how important that is to, in a service firm, to have very clear-cut training methods and modules for your employees so that you reduce inconsistency. So here's a simplified journey map of joining a gym. Highlight. So in other words, the customer first goes to phone up the gym for prices. These are the actual questions that they ask. And this is the process itself. So the reception takes the call. They take the customer contact details for the SAM team to call back. And then you want to really do qualitative, experience-based ethnography or netnography to assess how your customers go through the experience and where you can improve there. And this is quite simplified. The way that we did it for doctors and accountants in the continuing education courses that I taught in this area was that we made what was called a service blueprint. And a service blueprint is taking your consumer's perspective through every touch point they have with your firm and identify what we call frontline services and back or behind the line services, and then where we can make changes to become more efficient. That's called a service blueprint. And as I was saying about the environment that impacts perceptions of service, those are called service scapes. So like landscape, in this case, it's a service scape. And so it's the environment in which the service is assembled and in which the seller and customer interact. So this is important from, again, the perspective, in an example in our continuing education course, a medical doctor who I challenged to create a service blueprint and a customer journey, had never actually walked into his facility through the front door. He had always parked in the back in his private parking spot and entered his medical facility from the back. And so he didn't notice things like how difficult it was for parking, or whether the landscaping needed updating, or whether the painting was bad, whether the lighting was poor, whether he had to have more handicap parking or a better ramp. And so by asking him to go through the actual service scape, to sit in his waiting room, to think about what he was smelling, what he was seeing, how did the seats feel? All of that, that exercise was a way for him to understand how he can improve the experience for customers. So for example, if you are selling luxury, then you better make sure that your service scape also reflects that for every sense: smell, sight, touch, sound. And those are the kinds of things that we ask service providers to do when they are thinking about why did they lose customers, or how can they differentiate their service offering better. Similarly, online servicescapes are just as important. And that is the customer journey that they go on when they reach or visit your website. And some of my clients have never checked on different devices. How does their website actually look? How does it look, given that by 2020, 80% of mobile search, 80% of search will be on mobile devices, whether that is, phones or tablets, etc. The idea there is your website that maybe you haven't updated for the last decade, is it mobile enabled? How quickly do pictures load? Do you have ways that people can communicate with you on the first page? So not necessarily making them click multiple times to get to where they're going. And by analyzing your website with a tool like Google Analytics, you can identify where the bottlenecks are in your website. So when do people leave your site? Chances are, if they abandon your site and go to a different site, it may be because whatever was on that page that they were last looking at was not capturing enough value for them. And so it can help you to, by looking at the analytics, to understand the customer journey better, understand how to capture the customer, keep them on your site longer, or maybe you're keeping them on the site too long and they need to just get particular information, and then maybe it's frustrating to them to stay on your site too long. So Rater, R-A-T-E-R, is a way to evaluate service quality. You also see this in literature as ServQual, service quality. So if we rearrange those 5 elements of service quality, you can spell the word Rater. So the first R is reliability, and that is, does the service firm have the ability to perform the service dependably and accurately? The A refers to assurance. Is the knowledge of and courtesy by employees and their ability to convey trust and confidence in their ability to perform the service, as well as to treat you the way you want to be treated? Tangibles is the appearance of physical facilities, equipment, personnel, and communication materials. So it's not simply the service scape, that would be just the physical facilities and the equipment perhaps, but also the appearance of personnel and appearance of your communication materials. E is for empathy, which we know is necessary in service provision because it's the caring, individualized attention provided to customers. This is why the service provider is often inexorably linked to the firm or the brand itself. And that's because that individualized attention is necessary for customers to feel like your service offering is differentiated from others. So this is why training is so important, so that all of your employees provide a consistent, empathic response and experience for your customers. And the final R is responsiveness. In other words, how willing do your service providers appear with regard to helping customers and providing prompt service? I recall, one particular doctor in the continuing education courses talking about how frustrated he would get when his patients wouldn't understand what he was saying. And a lot of it probably had to do with the fact that he wasn't really appearing empathic to his customers, which in this case are his patients, and maybe he didn't appear as willing to help them or find a solution. So these are ways that you think about a service provider like a doctor or an accountant. They're never really taught how to do this. They're not taught how to run a business, a service business. They're taught how to, provide medical assistance or how to provide accounting, how to do accounting. And so that's why in the examples that I'm giving were, our university attempts to bridge that gap between understanding why services marketing is different than product marketing and how a service provider can understand how to improve his or her service quality. Part of this, at the end of your chapter, they go into this idea of what's called service dominant logic. And that's the understanding that the customer is a co-creator of value in the service firm. And I think it's important to talk about. This is Vargo and Lush is a really important piece, but I'm not going to ask any questions on this on the exam. What I will talk about is service recovery, because that's a fun psychological quirk. What service recovery regards is the fact that things go wrong more frequently with services. So what I would like for you to do, and I believe this is part of your assignment this week, is to go to the United Brakes Guitars video. So you can either just Google or go to YouTube and search, quote, United Brakes Guitars, and watch the 3-minute song. And really to understand how these bad service encounters can lead to customer complaints, expensive corrections, loss of business, and bad word of mouth. In fact, with United Brakes Guitars, we often call that the tipping point in understanding the power of social media, because within, I think it was a day of posting, that video over a decade ago was shared over 150,000 times. And when the company tried to correct the service failure from the video, it was already too late. What we really need to understand as a service provider is that a complaint is an opportunity to provide great service. And here's the psychological phenomenon. Customers are likely to evaluate a firm higher if a mistake is made and corrected than had the service been delivered correctly the first time. Let me show you that in a graph. In other words, if we look at the dotted blue line here, these are customers without a service failure. So yes, they do have a positive journey where customer loyalty goes up over time. Now let's look at the red line. The red line you see here, they're going about the same experience as customers without a service failure. But then as the service failure happens and directly after it happens, we see a negative slope to this loyalty curve. And then something really surprising happens. If the service has been recovered, in other words, a complaint is made and the company repairs or rights the wrong, that's what we mean by recovery, to the satisfaction of the customer and the firm, what we find is that the customers actually boomerang and their loyalty actually goes even higher than customers without a service failure. So ultimately, customers with a service failure and successful recovery end up having higher loyalty to that same company that failed them than a customer who never experienced a service failure. This is just a phenomenon of, we've explored this, or other researchers have explored the cognitive phenomenon underlying service recovery paradox. And we can't necessarily predict when this is going to happen. In fact, it doesn't necessarily happen every time. Not all research finds this huge boomerang effect. But what we do know is that a second failure destroys the effect. I think your assignment will have you kind of explore this in your own service purchases. So in summary, there are 7 P's in services marketing. The first 4 are the same as we've been talking about all semester, adding the 5th, 6th, and 7th P. Customers perceive services as risky due to their inconsistency or unpredictability, and therefore sometimes services are harder to brand. Some services are product reliant. So in other words, there is a continuum of services from 100% product to 100% service, and most companies are somewhere in between. And some services are more skill reliant, so training, hiring becomes really important here. Finally, good service recovery is essential. I think you'll really enjoy the activity this week for exploring services in more detail with your own service recovery example.